Welcome to the Apex Energy Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Al-Qattan. Today, my guest is Formscapes. How are you doing today? So you also go by Keelan, right?
Yeah. Keelan's my name. Formscapes is my YouTube channel and my general internet moniker. But yeah,
Damn.
yeah. So glad to
Uh,
be here. Glad to be here.
awesome. Yeah. Do you mind just giving like a brief introduction about yourself? Like what do you do and what kind of subjects you talk about on YouTube?
Ah, man, it's a little bit difficult to encapsulate, but generally speaking, I'm a philosopher. I deal with a number of different topics within that realm. Process philosophy is one. The German idealist, German phenomenology movement is another. I also delve into a lot of peripheral topics that can link in with that. Ideas in the philosophy of biology, for example, ideas about morphogenetics, divergent ideas within science, broadly speaking. And so it's a pretty broad territory. I also kind of dip into more esoteric or even theological topics sometimes as they fit into the pictures that I try to sketch out. So yeah, that's the general gist at least.
Okay. Yeah, awesome. And we are going to be diving into many of the subjects that you just mentioned. But before we do, I just kind of want to give a preface to the viewer that in contemporary science, there seems to exist this so-called scientific world view. And it seems that so many people within this 21st century are charmed by the scientific method because of the development of technologies and the development of modern medicine. So the scientific method holds a high place within Western cultures, especially, but just in the 21st century, normally I would say just people hold it up to a very high standard. However, there seems to be this belief that is sandwiched in with this scientific method, and let's call this belief the philosophy of materialism, right? And materialism is basically this idea that matter is unconscious, that the universe is purposeless, that animals and biological organisms are mechanical in nature. Richard Dawkins called living beings as lumbering robots with central nervous systems, right? So it's basically this stereotypical, atheist materialist belief that has kind of merged itself with the scientific worldview. So, in the spirit of science, let's use skepticism. Let's kind of analyze some of these beliefs, if you don't mind, and we'll go through and I'll ask you some questions just to get some of your input. So let's start with the question. First of all, what is this philosophy of materialism to you, and what do those beliefs entail?
Well, as with any belief system, materialism is a story. It's got its own history of how and why it came about, and that story is very much interlinked with transformations that were happening in philosophy, really over the course of the past 400 years or so. You could trace it back much further than that if you wanted to. You could take this all the way back to the medieval scholastics in the 13th century. Actually, that's not a bad starting point, actually. But a lot of people will kind of set the initial goalpost at Rene Descartes, who, much like Richard Dawkins, suggested that most, or really all plants and animals other than human beings, were automata. They were machines, essentially, and it was humans who were unique in actually having consciousness and being truly animate, in other words. And so it's really with Descartes that you get the beginnings, first of all, with the initial break of Western philosophy from the Western tradition itself and the birth of a truly modern philosophy. But second of all, it's also the beginnings of what we could call dualism, the idea that subjectivity, subjective interiority, is somehow of a completely different ontological or metaphysical register than materiality. Materiality becomes conceptualized as that which is purely objective. It lacks interiority. It's characterized fundamentally by what later philosophers would go on to call primary qualities, but not secondary qualities. So you get this idea developed later on in the British empiricist tradition that objects in the world have these qualities that are relative to observers. So, for example, the way that an item of food tastes is relational with regards to the subjectivity of the person eating the food. So that's a secondary quality, as they said. And then a primary quality, that would be objective things, such as the actual chemical composition of the food, the carbohydrates and sugars, glucose, things like that. And so then this division gets further elaborated in Kant. You get the phenomenal realm as divided from the noumenal realm, and then that becomes its whole thing because that spins off into the German idealism movement. And essentially what happens gradually over time is you have this tendency developing whereby scientists and some philosophers, really not that many, but at least a good handful, began really during the 19th century, this tendency of taking that mind-matter bifurcation and then just sawing off the mind part of it, so that somehow you could explain everything, including mind, including subjectivity, in terms of the purely objective. And this, of course, created a very difficult conceptual tightrope to try to walk. And I think we're at a place right now, at least within academic philosophy, and many scientists as well are beginning to come around to this too, that there just is no way to square that circle. You're never going to get consciousness out of just dead, inert, lifeless BBs bouncing around in the void. And that's kind of where we're at right now, and that's kind of what I've waded into, because even though there is, I think, a growing acknowledgement within academia that ideas like panpsychism and idealism, or just theism more generally, have to be taken seriously, and they have to be regarded as legitimate ways of dealing with these problems that were generated by materialism. Nevertheless, there's still this kind of hanging on to the idea that we can just kind of reconceptualize things, and then somehow all of the established academic mainstream science will remain intact after that. And that's just not going to happen. There's so many things downstream of this that follow from reconceptualizing how we think about consciousness and how we think about matter. And this is a big problem for a lot of people, because for a lot of people, that materialism isn't just a little metaphysical presupposition that's, performing this purely analytic function. The very idea of scientific prestige and materialism, the idea of really just knowledge in general, and the way that we've come to conceptualize it, especially after World War II, and carrying over into the 21st century, has developed this form where it really has come to serve as a kind of pseudo-religion for people in a lot of ways. And when that happens, people get really defensive about it. Once you've got something that's not just a belief, once it starts to become a grounding for your sense of security and orientation towards the world, then it gets personal. And that's the kind of thing that you see once you start bumping into these issues. Yeah.
Okay, great answer. And I really just want to flesh out your answer pretty much, because there's so much packed in there, so much I want to know and understand. I'll start with this question. Basically, I want to get your just straight up opinion about is the question is matter conscious? Or sorry, is matter unconscious?
I'm not sure if the idea, well, okay, I should start with this. Of course, I have to do the pedantic philosopher thing and say it depends on how you define consciousness. But if we're meaning that very broadly in the sense of subjectivity, of some kind of primordial feeling or experience or awareness, I'm not convinced that there's any coherent way to conceptualize anything as being purely objective without any relationship to subjectivity whatsoever.
Hmm.
Um, because once you do that, things just they get weird and you can
Hmm.
dance around it, but um, so for example, the world that we inhabit obviously has consciousness in it because we're here to observe it. But then start thinking about possible universes, right? Could we imagine a universe in which there was no consciousness, in which you really just had BBs bouncing around in the void? But then you have to ask this question. In what sense would a hypothetical universe like that actually be real, as opposed to merely possible, as opposed to merely a potentiality? For this universe, we have a very ready answer to that, which is, well, we're here for it, right? If there's nobody who's there for it, in what sense is there anything that distinguishes it from being merely a potentiality, merely something fantastical as opposed to really real?
Hmm.
Um, and so I think there's a very deep connection here, and this would get us into some very metaphysical territory if we started to try to
Okay.
really pry into this. But just to summarize very quickly, I think there is a very deep connection between the very idea of consciousness and the very idea of existence itself. And that
Yeah.
you can't really separate those two things, I don't think.
Okay. Interesting. So I think it might be helpful to just hold on to this mind and matter split, this materialist split, and operate from that perspective, and just to see how things line up. So let's kind of stay within it and compare it maybe to other different models that philosophers and scientists have presented. So let's start from the point of what is the bifurcation of nature? You've talked about it in some of your videos. What is it? Uh, how did it come about, and how does it affect the thought and the metaphysics of the masses?
Yeah, so that phrase bifurcation of nature is something that I'm borrowing from the metaphysician and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead, who has been a huge influence on my work. And as Whitehead sees it, it's essentially what I just said about Descartes. It's the idea that there can be this prying apart of consciousness from purely objective materiality, and in doing so, you generate a very large number of conceptual problems that I would argue aren't really solvable. But this goes a bit deeper than that, and well, I don't know if I should say deeper than that. That's really the bedrock of it. I should say that it fans out into other areas. Let's put it that way,
Hmm.
in the
Hmm.
sense that it kind of goes hand in hand with an idea which is actually maybe a bit more ancient now that I'm thinking about it, that the human world, that humanity itself is something separate from nature. And especially in the modern world in which we're just completely inundated with technologies,
Hmm.
it's really easy to kind of buy into that idea without even noticing that it's there, because it's really gotten to the point where all of our relationships with reality in general are mediated in some way or another by technology. I mean, you really have to go out of your way to put that all aside and to just be in the world. And so it reinforces this idea, which is implicit within this bifurcation of nature, that reality itself is fundamentally mechanical. when you're surrounded by machines, then it feels like much less of a stretch to think that the whole world it consists entirely of mechanical processes, that living
Mm.
organisms are somehow just squishy machines, and that there's all there is to it. And if we just continued along doing science for long enough, eventually we would figure out how everything can be just reduced down to particles in motion, and we'll get there eventually, we promise. Um, and again, any thread you pull on here, you're gonna reveal cracks within it, right?
Yeah.
Within living
Yeah.
systems in particular,
Mm.
that way of looking at it just doesn't work. And when you actually, if you look past, some biologists like Richard Dawkins, for example, has this very mechanistic rhetoric about life. He calls it the blind watchmaker, right? Implying that nature is blind and that organisms are like watches, they're machines somehow. Um, if you look past that, though, and you look at what biologists are actually doing, um, oftentimes the way that they think about things doesn't actually accord with that at all. And when it comes to where the rubber actually meets the road, they don't think of organisms as machines, because dealing with that is just an extremely sloppy way of addressing how biological processes actually operate in the real world. And so you have to have this kind of, elaborate apologetics in which you have to somehow suggest that all of these different terms used by biologists can somehow, at the end of the day, be broken down into mere matter. And again, it's just one of those things where it's an uncashed check. You'll never actually be able to accomplish that. I don't think it certainly isn't going to be accomplished anytime soon.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just
Mm-hmm.
kind of this promise that eventually we'll get there, right?
Okay. And I know that the traditional view of mind and matter is that the mind is inside of, a central nervous system or within a brain, let's say, encapsulated, and that matter is out there. So the difference is a difference of location, a difference in space. I know I'm not very well versed into Whitehead. I'm so curious about him, and this is partly the reason why I really wanted to get you on. But Whitehead, I read that he differentiates mind and matter as a difference within time, as opposed to it being spatial. Are you familiar with that concept? And maybe if you are, could you explain it further?
No, he doesn't really distinguish mind and matter at all.
Okay.
So Whitehead, um, so he develops this fundamental metaphysics within his Harvard Gifford lectures, which then became the book Process and Reality. And in that, he conceptualized the world in such a way that the ontological fundamentals, so the most basic building blocks of nature, are what he calls occasions of experience. Sometimes he'll call them actual entities to suggest that all actual entities, all actualities have these properties he's describing.
Hmm.
At one point, he describes them as electromagnetic droplets of experience, which I think is just a wonderfully poetic way of putting it, which is also suggestive about all kinds of ways in which this might link up with physics. But in any
Hmm.
case, the way that he kind of um, elaborates what he sees as the anatomy of these droplets um, is a, you could call it a polarity, right? So you have a mental pole and a physical pole. But and I think this is probably what you stumbled across, because the way he uses those terms doesn't quite accord with the way we typically use them
Hmm.
colloquially. We think of mental as the realm of the subjective, whereas physical is just like merely physical. But
Hmm.
for Whitehead, these are two different kinds of basic experiences. So there's physical experiences. You can call that sensation, for example, your contact
Hmm.
with the world. And then what he's calling the mental pole. Those are what it calls them conceptual prehensions. And so those are basically feelings of possibilities. And so you can think of those mental poles, those conceptual prehensions, as being kind of like you can think of it as being the mode of our awareness which is concerned with possibility. You can think of it as kind of a field of possibilities that we then kind of collapse down into actualities, actual
Hmm.
events, and then once those events have occurred, then they become available to be inherited into subsequent moments, which is the realm of sensation. So, for example, like whenever you're looking just at the world around you, in a sense, all of your sensory impressions are of the past. They are of events that have already happened, right? So no matter how close something is to your face, the light takes some concrete amount of time to travel, and therefore you're seeing the events in question as they were one, light meter ago, or whatever the
Hmm.
case may be, right? And the same thing goes for our bodies, right? Our physical sensation of our bodies is the state our bodies were in a moment ago, and that is then kind of amalgamated with all these different all these other aspects of our experience. And so, not to get super technical with it, just to
Yeah.
summarize a bit here, the overall gist of Whitehead's philosophy is that he sees these actual entities, these moments of experience, as being the basic building blocks of organisms. And so for Whitehead, the basic processes which constitute the world are organic processes, which are fundamentally animate, fundamentally experiential. They're fundamentally self-generative in many ways. So there's a kind of indeterminacy there, but it's not a probabilistic indeterminacy. It's a
Hmm.
self-determination. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, what he's doing is you can really think of it as the British empiricist tradition taken to its logical extreme just becomes a newfangled form of shamanic animism, because that's kind of what it is in certain ways. So, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I know. That's really the fascinating part with me because I'm familiar with the shamanic animism, and hearing this process philosophy just sounds so much like it. Let's stay on the topic of Alfred North Whitehead. Do you mind just giving a little bit of backstory behind who this guy is and why is he so important?
Yeah. So Whitehead was um, one of the biggest names in mathematical logic during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He worked very closely with Bertrand Russell, who is another big name within the realm of Western analytic philosophy in general, but also mathematical logic. They wrote a book called the Principia Mathematica, which no one ever reads because it looks like hieroglyphics, but it exists and supposedly it's important. So anyway, um, and so in World War I, Whitehead's son died in combat, and this was a very devastating life event for him. And ultimately, he ended up selling most of his possessions and leaving Britain for the United States, where he ended up teaching philosophy at Harvard. And that's where he began to take in a lot of inspiration from the American pragmatist tradition, particularly the works of William James and John Dewey. And while there, he begins to develop these broader ideas about really the very nature of science, and where science is at and how that relates to the philosophical tradition. And eventually, by 1927, this is going to become his process philosophy, his big picture metaphysical scheme of things. And it's also worth keeping in mind here that Whitehead, being a mathematician and a logician, is also very much shoulder and shoulder with what's happening in the world of physics around the time. He was in communication with Einstein. He was actually very critical in many ways of Einstein's general relativity. According to Einstein, whenever they talked, Einstein couldn't understand a word that Whitehead was trying to say to him, which is kind of funny, though I do wonder what those conversations were like. But in any
Yeah.
case, this was also around the exact same time that the origins of what will eventually become quantum field theory and particle physics, the standard model, all that was kind of cooking at the time, right? And so in 1914, that's where you had Max Planck quantized electromagnetism. He brings in this idea that you can divide up any kind of photonic or electromagnetic events into these discrete quanta. They're not perfectly continuous and infinitely divisible. There are packets involved somehow. Now, in 1927, the exact same time that Whitehead is giving the Gifford lectures that will become Process and Reality, that's the same year. I always forget the name of it. There was this conference at the time. Everybody's seen the pictures. It's like that photo, and it's like all the physicists and Einstein and Niels Bohr. They're all there
Yeah.
together. That was that event, and so that's where all of the major ideas that we typically associate with quantum mechanics came into play, because they were all just kind of derived from that quantization of electromagnetism, which had been put on the table 14 years prior. And so in that year, that's where you get the uncertainty principle, the complementarity principle, non-locality, blah, 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 blah. All of it kind of
Mm-hmm.
comes in at that point. And so Whitehead, he's definitely got his fingers on the pulse of that, as it were, and you can see it in many ways throughout Process and Reality, the way that he conceptualizes these moments of experience as being atomic, not in the sense of like little BBs, but atomic in the sense of being these kind of discrete, indivisible units. It's pretty clear that he's drawing from Planck's quantization of electromagnetism in framing things that way, and a number of other things. But anyway, that's the general idea. And this is really important, I think, because in a lot of ways, Whitehead is kind of revivifying the Platonic tradition. There's a lot of ways in which his philosophy is just kind of Platonism, but there's also a lot of ways in which it's not, because he's also incorporating all these ideas that have been developed over the subsequent 2,500 years. He's trying to really be true to the tradition of British empiricism and the scientific tradition, and kind of incorporate those things into what he's doing. And so it's really important, I think, because it gives us a way to kind of take all of these more modern ideas and concepts, the things that we've learned about the world over the course of modernity, and weave those together with these mystical, philosophical, metaphysical traditions that take us way back into the origins of certainly Hellenic civilization, probably much, much further than that, but at the very least that far. So, yeah.
Okay, awesome. I want to understand process philosophy a little bit more. It does sound like, to quote you, gobbledygook. When I watch some of the videos, it gets really deep really fast. And Rupert Sheldrake himself notoriously said that it was difficult for him to follow at first as well. So, if you don't mind, let's go ahead and just kind of break down some concepts and define them and explain how the mechanisms might work. Concrescence, from what I understand, is the coming together of this physical pole and the mental pole, and that's what this actuality is, right? Or something being created, I guess, or something existing. Is that the right way maybe to frame it?
Yeah. So the word concrescence, there's kind of an intimation there of convalescence, coalescence, things coming together to form wholes. And that's really important here. Whitehead says concrescence is the process by which the many become one and are increased by one. So what he means by that then is that you're taking a multiplicity of different little kind of atomic experience, atomic relations, and you're weaving them together into a totality that is more than the sum of its parts, right? They become one and are increased by one, as in the wholeness that is achieved is something really ontologically separate than the parts. It's not a mere aggregation. So
Okay.
he's gesturing towards a very organic idea, a very organismic idea of ontological holism here. So if you may have run across the term holon at some point. It's
Hmm.
very similar to that. Yeah, so the concrescence really is just Whitehead's term for any organic process, and really even mechanistic processes are just kind of aggregations of organic processes, right? So if you think about something like your phone, for example, is not itself an organic whole per se. Its structure is imposed upon it by human beings. But if you zoom in to the level of the silicate
Mm.
molecules and polymers and whatnot, what you find are these self-perpetuating, self-generating systems that are just because of the form that we have imposed upon them, they're just kind of sitting there inert, just kind of repeating themselves because that's how we like it. We like things to be very predictable when we make machines and computer systems and things like that, because if a machine has a mind of its own, that's usually not a compliment. You want things to behave in very predictable ways insofar as you're thinking technologically. But organisms are not like that. Organisms are always navigating distributions of possibility. And for Whitehead, that's what he's referring to by the mental pull, the conceptual prehensions, the feelings of possibilities that the organism is then kind of selecting from or drawing into itself in a selective way so as to kind of reshape itself as it navigates the world.
Okay. And mechanizing and creating a linear system out of organisms is not really an alien idea to us. I mean, we do it to animals and plants. So doing that, extrapolating that further into, like particles and within physics would actually kind of make sense. We kind of just do that with everything around us. Okay. So he also has this term prehension that you mentioned as well. Prehension, from what I understand, is seizing or grasping, and it can occur in different ways. So there's three types of prehension, from what I understand. There's a conceptual prehension, and then there's a physical prehension and a hybrid prehension. And I'll just let me know if any of this is wrong. But physical prehension, from what I know, is going from past to present, which is essentially ordinary physics, right? The stuff that we study in schools. And then we have this conceptual prehension, which is grasping on or seizing the past, which is from present to past, right? It's the other way around. Is that correct?
It's more like present to future for conceptual
Okay.
prehension, because you're looking at possibilities that have not been actualized yet in order to kind of determine how things come to actualize. Essentially,
Okay.
that's what it
Okay.
amounts to. Yeah.
So there are potentialities
Yes,
that
exactly.
could exist within the future. Okay.
Mhm.
And what about hybrid prehension? What is that?
So that's where things get a little bit more complicated, but it's
Okay.
also where things get really interesting. Before I talk about that, though, one quick thing is I think it's actually better to say that there are four types of
Okay.
prehensions, and the reason why is simply because of that kind of holism I was talking about before. So so a prehension, again, it's a grasping, and the reason he's using a term like that is because he's trying to emphasize this idea that within our experience is not just a kind of mirroring of the world. It's not just like we've got this heads up display screen that is our consciousness that's just depicting the world to us. Our consciousness is an incorporation of the world into us, right? And all experience operates that way. Now, with regards to, oh yeah, that fourth thing. So yeah, you got physical prehensions, conceptual prehensions, hybrid prehensions, and then the whole that is generated from that synthesis is itself
Hmm.
a prehension. It is a complex feeling, and so he calls that a complex prehension. And so that's like the
Hmm.
fourth type, is like the synthesis of the former three.
Yeah, interesting. And that creates a hole. And that those holes themselves, right? Is that correct? Interact with other holes, and that creates another, or a holon. Is the correct term a holon or a hole when it creates a new kind
Yeah,
of
you could call it a holon. So if
okay.
you it, he uses this term society a lot, which
Hmm.
seems like he's basically using that term as synonymous with organism, which is to say that if you think of your composition, you can think of it as this really complex web of smaller actual entities, smaller moments of becoming that are all
Mm.
just kind of woven together into this social whole. And yeah, you could think of that as a holon. I think that's a good term to use here. And yeah, I mean, this is something that you can scale up or down pretty much indefinitely. You could look at a tribe, a town, a village as really being its own kind of nexus of experience.
Yeah.
You could look at like an ant colony or a beehive, for example, in the same way. It's kind of just a matter of how interwoven things are, because that's then going to determine the degree to which the individual constituents are able to kind of operate on their own and kind of just carry out their own desire for self-generation and whatnot. With something like a beehive or an ant colony or whatnot, you don't
Hmm.
have very
Hmm.
much agency for the individual parts. And therefore, I think we could say that the consciousness which we see there as it's more at the colonial level, whereas for us human beings it seems like our consciousness is much more localized within individuals. So if there's a a kind of social consciousness for like a tribe or a town or a city or a nation or what have you, that's a bit dimmer, you could
Hmm.
say,
Hmm.
than individual human consciousness. So yeah.
Okay, awesome. And what about the term, he uses the term eternal objects? What does he mean when he refers to that?
So those are your potentialities. The
Okay.
term eternal object is kind of like Whitehead's term for Platonic forms.
Hmm.
Um, and he intentionally dodges the word form for certain technical reasons we don't really need to get into, but
Yeah.
that's essentially what he's talking about. He's talking about possibilities in themselves, which then organisms kind of latch on to, prehend, as it were, and then
Mm.
they kind of come together into these complex eternal objects, complex forms, like what you see in living bodies, for example. And that's just how that navigation of possibility space works, essentially.
Okay, awesome. And I want to ask now about another process philosopher, Henri Bergson. Who is he, and how does he play into this whole process philosophy?
So Bergson, interestingly, was another mathematician. He was a French mathematician initially who became a philosopher over the course of his career. And in many ways, his philosophy is a lot like Whitehead's. It's his philosophy is very evolutionary in character. He thinks of time as being an expression of creativity, very similar to what Whitehead's doing.
Hmm.
And a lot of Bergson's philosophy was focused on time in particular, and and really the ways in which our modern scientific ways of thinking about time just don't really accord with what time has to be if we actually look at it through the lens of our experience, when we actually look at the phenomenon of time as it is actually presented to us in the real world, as opposed to filtered through a very complex web of mathematical equations and abstract ideas and whatnot.
Hmm.
Bergson, much like Whitehead, is very interested in remaining true to the reality of our experience, because according to both of them, once you once you detach yourself from experience, you're not doing science anymore, let alone, or well, you're not doing philosophy anymore, let alone science.
Hmm.
Because the whole idea of science, the whole idea of natural philosophy is empiricism, to begin with the world we actually encounter and to go from there. So if at some point you're kind of kicking out the ladder underneath you and saying that our experience is just some kind of illusion or simulation, or whatever the
Hmm.
hot word is this week, you're really sawing off the branch you're sitting on, because then you don't have a way to refer back to the ground that you're supposedly starting from, and then you're
Hmm.
just kind of you've just kind of bootstrapped yourself into this world of fantastical abstraction at that point. So Bergson and Whitehead are both trying to avoid that. Whitehead has a
Hmm.
very nice term that he uses for this. He says, he uses the term misplaced concreteness to refer to what he sees as this tendency whereby we take our abstractions, our models and whatnot, and then kind of mistake the map for the territory. Um, and again,
Hmm.
Bergson is also very keenly aware of this problem. And so Bergson, in pursuing these questions, he arrives at some very interesting conclusions, many of which do jive pretty well with Whitehead's ideas and Sheldrake's ideas. Sheldrake was very much influenced by Bergson, even more so than Whitehead. Bergson concludes that memories cannot just be stored in the brain. Somehow they have to be regenerations of what has actually occurred in the past. He also says that time must be understood as a kind of a kind of withholding or forestalling of decisions. He thinks about the way we experience objects in the world in terms of potentiality. So Whitehead's talking about, us feeling these fields of possibility, and then we have kind of our sensory experience, and we would associate that with our encounters with physical objects in the world around us. Bergson kind of takes that a step further in a way, and he says that even our experiences of objects in the world are really experiences of possible actions in a way. And so we could go on and on about this. Bergson is actually someone who I've been trying to delve into more so lately. I'm much more familiar with Whitehead, really.
Hmm.
But yeah, Bergson, again, he was also very critical of Einstein's special relativity in
Hmm.
particular. And so, yeah, again, you have this kind of connection to the transformations happening in physics around that time period in the early 20th century.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Were they influenced by each other, or did those ideas emerge independently?
I think it was mostly independent. I know
Wow.
Whitehead was at least familiar with Bergson because he references him a couple of times. I'm
Wow.
not entirely sure if Bergson
Okay.
was familiar with Whitehead, but again, I'm less familiar with Bergson's body of work, so it just might be that I haven't seen
Okay.
where he talks about Whitehead yet.
So essentially, subjectivity then is a fundamental aspect of reality. It cannot just be written out the way these materialists try to write it out within this modern scientific worldview. Just in so many aspects, we're trying to always get quote unquote objective results and remove suck the subjectivity out. But it's impossible. It's just not possible. It's a dead end. It won't lead anywhere essentially, right?
Right. And really, what we're trying to achieve here is we're trying to achieve intersubjectivity, because we're trying to reveal the compositional features of nature, which transcend particular events, particular relationships. We're trying to look at that which we can generalize, because then once we can generalize, then we can do something with that. We can build spaceships and whatnot once we're able to figure out how these different things interact. And so that kind of um, drive towards understanding nature, it has been kind of mutated in some ways over time. So if you look at figures like Isaac Newton or Johann von Goethe, for example, or even the medieval alchemists for that matter, all of these guys were mystics. I mean, they really saw what they were doing not as trying to understand a world of dead, inert BBs bouncing around. They were trying to understand the mind of God. And they
Mm,
were quite literal about that, you know? And so there was not yet this pretension of just transcending subjectivity entirely. That wasn't there. And in fact, Goethe in particular is very adamant about this in a way that's very reminiscent of the way Whitehead and Bergson are going to be about it later on, this insistence that we don't get lost in our abstractions. In his critique of Newton, for example, and although Newton was definitely a mystic in his own right as well, Goethe is
mm,
very critical of Newton in that he thinks that Newton, in trying to understand the nature of light, he's employing these ideas of waves and frequencies and things like that, and so um, Newton is trying to kind of reduce down the experience of color down to these alleged physical properties such as the wavelengths of light. And Goethe's like, this can never work. And he points to the fact that our color is necessarily a relational phenomenon. Something that looks blue within one context can look gray in another, and you don't have to do anything to the wavelengths of light. They needn't change at all. And so what
mm,
Goethe is drawing from this, he's like, there's a relationship to what the light's doing, sure, but light itself, or excuse me, color itself is a relational phenomenon. It is something that happens between observer and world. And so you can't just divide this up into primary and secondary qualities. So Goethe's like, look, if we're going to really understand color, we need to actually understand the rainbow and stop pretending that we're trying to understand something kind of pre-subjective underlying that. Look at the actual structure of the color wheel itself and how that actually operates. And so he develops this theory of optics, which is actually very elaborate, but his starting
mm.
place is very different than Newton's. Newton's trying to start with something that's purely physical, at least in as much as he possibly can. Goethe understands it in this much more kind of esoteric way. He tries to understand color in terms of this dynamic interplay between light and darkness, and it's super
Mm.
fascinating. It's a really cool theory that he developed, and it seems to accord very well with our modern understanding of how color perception actually works. So,
That's
um,
I yeah. I have to check that out. That sounds awesome. I didn't even know Goethe. Yeah, Goethe just sounded like that guy was different, man. I mean, he was doing it all: the literature, the science, the just the philosophy. I mean, yeah, just sounds like
poetry,
an
geology. I mean, he was a polymath.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
He was the Renaissance man, so to speak. Yeah. Okay, so I want to ask about go back to Henri Bergson. From what I know, he kind of counteracted this Cartesian split by presenting something called mechanical and organic causation. Did you is that similar to Whitehead's ideas of
Yeah, it's essentially
pretension?
this. Yeah, it's essentially the same thing we've got going on with Whitehead, though Bergson conceptualizes it a bit differently. The way
Mm,
that Bergson thinks of it, um, you kind of think of it like this: like Whitehead is kind of oriented more towards the future in a way, like he's thinking of like conceptual prehension as this kind of possibility space.
mm,
And there's definitely room for that in Bergson's philosophy. I think they complement each other very well. But the way Bergson looks at it is the way that these processes relate to the past. So Bergson says that within a mechanical process, you've really just got something where the like immediately prior event just kind of necessitates what happens in the subsequent event. So just like dominoes knocking each other over, right? Whereas within organic processes, organic causation, um, there's this incorporation of a kind of broader scope of the past. And this is where Bergson's ideas start to really incorporate ideas about memory and learning into the fundamentals of his understanding of consciousness. So, typically within the modern kind of neuropsychological way we think about these things, we tend to think of learning and memory as things that are like specialized functions that our nervous systems perform for us. Bergson says no, these are actually fundamental to the nature of animacy itself. And what we see in the human being are just very elaborated forms of these fundamental archetypes, but these fundamental archetypes of memory and learning are there at the bedrock. And so if you think about it in a way this makes sense, whenever you make a kind of split-second decision where you're just kind of not really thinking about it, it is more mechanical in a sense. But then there's this kind of withholding when you're really thinking, when you're really present for what you're doing, where you are in thinking about the decision that you're making, you're kind of incorporating, you're re-invoking the past, the things that you've done before that may relate to what you're doing now in some way or another, so as to inform the way that you're doing what you're doing now. So there's this kind of rebirth, as it were, of the past into the present. And the way that Bergson thinks about it is the more we're doing that, the more of the past we're bringing into the present, the more consciousness is there, in a word, the more intensity there is within that moment of experience, we could say.
Okay. And so how do these ideas relate or overlap with German idealism, specifically with Kant's ideas, and with phenomena and noumena? How does it overlap, or is it kind of a little bit different?
So this is a long story. So
Okay.
yeah, but let's do it. All right. So let's start with Bergson. So within Kant, you've got this phenomena noumena distinction where there's the phenomenal realm, which is the world of basically what you call secondary qualities, that which is structured by the organizational principles of our consciousness, so as to kind of render the world to us. And then you have the noumenal reality, which is the world in itself. Now, the way that Kant conceptualizes this, there's not really a way to actually contact the world itself. All we ever actually contact are phenomena. And so we can't really say anything about what the world actually is. There's presumably got to be something behind our experiences, but what is that, we can't know. And within Kant's philosophy, this is really a line that he's drawing in a very purposeful way, because this is the critique of pure reason, which is to say delineating the bounds of what pure reason can actually do. And outside of those bounds, that's where Kant's going to place his belief in God and free will and these other things that he feels like have been endangered by the advance of modern philosophy since Descartes. Bergson and Whitehead are not going to be cool with that way of doing things. So Bergson, the way he handles this is very interesting. And actually, I should back up a little bit before going on to Bergson. We should look at how that kind of Kantian conception plays into modern materialism. There's this idea that there's the world that we experience it, and there's this presumption that whatever is behind those experiences is matter in itself, which has these purely objective qualities, and that's just all there is to it. It's just mere matter. And so what Bergson does is very clever. He's like, okay, sure, let's buy that. So the world in itself, independently of us, is made of mere matter. Okay, cool. So but we're going to be good empiricists about this. We're not gonna overstretch into any weird metaphysical abstractions. So all we've got is what we experience, and then that which is still there when we look away, because that's how it works. You look away from the thing and you look back, the thing is still there. So what's there when you're not looking? Bergson says, well, there's only one thing it could possibly be: potential experiences, or he says virtual experiences. So there's this idea that Bergson's getting at, which again jives very well with Whitehead, that matter itself consists, you could say, of possible relationships, and those possible relationships, once they are actualized, are the contents of experience.
Hmm.
And you see something very similar in Whitehead. Whitehead's very adamant that he's wanting to break down this barrier that he feels like Kant has erected between us and the world. And this is part of the reason, like I mentioned before, why he's using this term prehension, this idea of grasping, and this idea that the
Yeah.
experiences are not just a screen that the world is projected on. There's actually a direct kind of symbiosis with the world that occurs in our experience, and it is that symbiosis that shapes what our experience actually is. So there's still room for perspectivity here, in the sense that the
Hmm.
way that the thing is revealed within my consciousness might be different than the way that is revealed within your consciousness, because we might be looking at it from different angles or thinking with different ideas or whatever the case may be. But ultimately, we are disclosing this kind of complex um, lattice of possible experiences there. And what we are revealing, what we're encountering, is the thing itself, because the thing itself is composed of those possible relationships. And so we're just actualizing those. And so it's not like there's this very mysterious matter which we can never possibly encounter, which is ever just beyond our reach. We are actually in the world. We're actually in it, as it were. And so in that regard, Whitehead and Bergson are both pushing
Hmm.
back pretty hard a bit against Kant. Now, as for the post-Kantian German idealists, that's where it gets a little bit more complicated, because those guys are going to do things in a very similar way to the way that Whitehead and Bergson do, especially Hegel and Schelling and Heidegger later on. They're going to kind of take Kant's basic presuppositions and then just run with them in a way that Kant didn't really anticipate, and come to some very similar conclusions as those that Bergson and Whitehead are going to come to. For example, just the ontological fundamentalness of consciousness, for example, that's there in basically everybody after Kant, except for maybe Fichte, I think. But regardless, you see a very similar trajectory in the German
Hmm.
idealist movement. And so it's interesting, because it's like if you take that German idealist movement and you just take it to its most logical extreme, and then you take the British analytic tradition that Whitehead was a part of and take it to its logical extreme, you kind of end up in a very similar place, which is interesting. It kind of implies that, all roads kind of lead to Rome, at
The
least
same
to
way.
some extent.
Awesome. Speaking of roads leading to the same place, uh, we can say that Henri Bergson and Whitehead are panpsychists, right? They believe that the universe is conscious in some manner, as well as some of the other thinkers that you talked about, like Goethe, perhaps. Um, it seems that some modern philosophers, I don't know if you're familiar with this, Galen Strawson published a journal in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, and he he published an article titled "Does Materialism Imply Panpsychism?" Uh, and I know about this because Rupert Sheldrake talks about it, and he talks about how even just within a materialist worldview, how can unconscious matter give birth to conscious beings, which we are conscious beings, right? The only way you can escape that statement is if you deny consciousness itself, in which a lot of materialists, people like Daniel Dennett do. They call it illusory, or they might even say it's epiphenomenal. But that obviously is not, just doesn't seem to be a good explanation. So to take that statement, how can unconscious matter give birth to conscious beings? We can kind of flip it on its head, and that's what this philosopher Galen Strawson does. He says, what if consciousness is more of a spectrum instead of unconscious matter and conscious? It's more of like everything is conscious to a certain extent, and that's kind of how it came about. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think materialism itself, if you go far enough into it, does it imply panpsychism?
Yeah, exactly. And you see this. I'm not as familiar with Galen Strawson's work, but this is a tendency. I think you see something very similar in Daniel Dennett for sure, and also Chalmers. It comes to similar conclusions for similar reasons, and trying to be as empiricist as you possibly can, or as materialist as you possibly can. You end up kind of in the same place no matter what. And Dennett is a great example of this, I think, because in his book, Consciousness Explained, Dennett really sets himself about the task of trying to rid Western analytic philosophy of mind of the ghost in the machine, as Ryle put it. He thinks he set himself the task of just trying to exercise this latent dualism that he sees within
Mm.
analytic philosophy of mind, and I think he's totally right about that, by the way. There is a latent dualism there, but the problem is that latent dualism is epiphenomenalism, and Dennett sees this quite clearly, actually. Whenever you try to conceptualize these things in such a way that you just start with dead matter, and then somehow, by organizing things in the right way, you get the projection of a completely new metaphysical domain out of that. You are working with a kind of dualism. The only difference is that in Cartesian dualism, you have two different kinds of fundamental substances, which are both there from the beginning. Within this kind of neo-epiphenomenalist dualism, excuse me, it's really just the same thing, only you're trying to start with one and then get the other out of it. But it's still dualism fundamentally, and Dennett's right. That is certainly the case. And over the course of Consciousness Explained, Dennett goes to bat attacking this, and his arguments are really good. He makes some very compelling arguments that kind of epiphenomenalism really just doesn't work, and it doesn't. And it's really there at the end, though, where you're like, okay, Dan, you're gonna actually come to the conclusion that you have to come to now, right? And he just kind of like waxes, and it's like he comes as close as he possibly can to the edge of the pool, and then kind of like dips
Yeah.
his toes in it, and then awkwardly waddles back because he's not willing to go that far, because he knows if he does, then suddenly all the woo-woo and the pseudoscientists and the religious people might actually have a point about some things, and he can't let them have that because there's intellectual enemies, right? So but yeah, point being, yes, if you go far enough, starting from almost any starting point, really, I think you kind of have to end up with very similar conclusions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to existence in general. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Great answer. Um, so I want to move on now to a different section now, and I want to actually trace back to one of the things that you mentioned. This one was a little bit difficult for me to grasp at first, but once I saw some of the evidence behind it, it really it's fascinating. And I want to ask you, what are your opinions on the idea that memories are not just stored as material traces, but that exist beyond just this physical body? It's basically challenging this idea that minds are not just confined to brains. What are some of the pieces of evidence maybe you could talk about that would allude or point to this idea?
Well, one of the first bits of evidence that we've had for over 100 years now is that there apparently are no engrams in the brain. So in the late 19th, early 20th century, scientists theorized that memories were somehow stored in patterns of neural circuitry or what have you, and that somehow we retrieve our memories by reactivating those. And so scientists began experimenting on this, and they uh, performed experiments on rats in which they basically taught the rats how to do things, developed memories within the rats' minds. And then they went in and rather barbarically, surgically, I believe they cauterized different parts of the rat's brains, trying to
Mm,
figure out where in the rat's brains the memories were. And what they found is as long as you've got enough brain left for the rat to actually stay alive, the memories can't be destroyed. They're still there somehow. So where are they? And scientists ended up kind of concluding, well, they've got to be just like distributed somehow. Okay, how? We know that certain parts of the brain do perform specific functions with regards to memory recollection. I believe it's
Mm.
the hypothalamus, which is concerned with kind of uh, with episodic memories, figuring out where and when specific memories occurred, but we still don't know where the memories are, and yet we're still running with this presumption that organic memory must be like computer memory, that somehow
Mm.
there is this storage of memory in a physical medium somehow.
Hmm.
And Bergson, of course, concludes that this just absolutely cannot be the case. It doesn't accord with our actual experience of memory. And if you really think about it for a second, like that metaphor just doesn't really hold much water. Like the way that our memories operate, they're never corrupted in the way that a computer memory is. You never run out of storage space for memories. Rather, what happens is when you've got a lot of memories that are very similar to one another and you don't have a specific event or feature to latch onto that can allow you to distinguish certain memories from others, then they kind of tend to blur together in a way. And we experience this all the time. You probably can't tell me where you were last Tuesday at 10 a.m. or whatever. I can't either, because I mean, it all just kind of runs together unless there's a specific reason to distinguish things. But all the information, as far as we know, is there. There doesn't seem to be any upper limit whatsoever. And how much memory a person can have.
Mm.
Another bit of evidence that's really interesting here is the phenomenon of terminal lucidity. So patients with Alzheimer's will, of course, lose their clarity, their lucidity as the disease progresses. They become increasingly unable to recognize people or to
Mm.
recall what year it is and all kinds of things like that. And from the kind of neurophysicalist perspective, it's like, okay, that's what's going on. There is physical damage that's happening to the brain, and the memories are being destroyed as a result of that. But then you have terminal lucidity, where in the final moments of life, final hours or what have you, for whatever reason, um, everything can just come back all of a sudden. So if it was just destroyed, right, like, I mean, where was it, and there's not a good answer for this within that kind of materialistic framework. And so the conclusion which Bergson and Sheldrake and myself have come to, and also Whitehead, he doesn't say this explicitly, because again, he's kind of oriented more toward the future than the past in a lot of ways, but you can see it kind of implicit, at least in his philosophy, for sure, that memory is something that actually isn't just a specialized function that's performed by nervous systems in this kind of vaguely computationalist manner. Rather, memory is a fundamental feature of nature as such. The past
Mm.
itself is not annihilated as it moves away from us into the past. And again, if you're thinking about these things in a purely mechanistic manner, then there's some very serious ontological ambiguity as to whether the past still even exists or not, right? Because if you think that every single event is determined fully by the event that immediately preceded it, then you've got all these other events that are way further in the past now. Where are they? They don't matter anymore. They're not in the game. They're just gone, essentially. Bergson, Whitehead, Sheldrake, you see this in mysticism as well, the idea of the Akashic field, Akashic record. Um, there's a total rejection of this.
Mm.
The creative products of time, the past, is still very much alive and is still very much participating in the present. And living systems, in a lot of ways, you can understand living systems as particular um, systems through which um, the past is regenerated into the present, brought into participation with the present in different ways, right? So for your body, for example, you can think of in this way. I believe it was Terence McKenna who once said that if you think about the human being in a kind of metatemporal way, you look at all the different little time slices kind of stacked along one another, the human being would look like a kind of worm, as it were, right? Because it would be like stretched through time. So, in a sense, what you've got here is you've got a sequence of these complex moments of organism, which are all kind of strung together. And the thing that is doing that stringing together is memory. All of that past, in some way or another, is being made available through the continuity of the organism. And so, yeah, with regards to evidence for that, though, I mean, we could look at Rupert Sheldrake's work. We could look at just, I mean, the entire field of parapsychology. There's a lot of different threads that I think point to that being the case. And when you start to look at it that way, memory, the actual phenomenon of memory, starts to look just way more comprehensible than it does if you look at it through this more mechanistic mode where things just don't really add up the way that they should, based on what that view of things would predict. So
Yeah. So one of the most fascinating examples I've come across was the work of Dr. Michael Levin and his example of his planary, his flatworm planaria, who where he would cut this planarian in half and they regenerate into two different planarians, no different than a magnet. When you cut a magnet in half, it doesn't turn into just a separate south and north, but it turns into their own individual magnets with their own north and south. So it was interesting how that similar effect happened within those planarians. But what he did these experiments where I saw that it would trade the planarian to do some type of behavior, and when he chopped up this planarian into maybe like up to 10 or more different pieces, each individual planarian that would regenerate would retain that memory. So you're cutting it off from its central nervous system, and it's still retaining it. So what is the glue that's holding that memory together? So what is the explanation he provides? Is it bioelectricity, right?
So Levin's really wishy-washy about this, unfortunately.
Okay.
He's trying, well, I mean, in the position that he's in, I mean, the dude's at Tufts University, and it's the same place
Yeah.
Dan Dennett works, right? Like, he's
Okay.
trying to be as respectable hard science as he can about this. So whenever he's asked about the relationship between his ideas and this more woo-woo stuff, he's like, well, and he's kind of got to be that way.
Yes.
But at the same time, his own research is pushing further and further in that direction. What Levin has said before is like, okay, well, clearly the memories are not stored in a particular place. So maybe they're in this kind of implicate structure that's not necessarily in the actual organization of the parts, but rather something that's at this kind of deeper organizational level. So he's drawing these ideas from kind of like systems theory and different ideas
Mm.
with computation about these kind of implied meta-organizational structures. I don't think that really works, but regardless, again, his own research is pushing further and further to the inescapability of these conclusions. So one thing that I found out about after I did my video on Sheldrake, which is the one where I really talked about his experiments, I was listening to him talk about some of the more recent research that he's done. And so we already mentioned the stuff with the planarians, right? So you cut these planarians into as many bits as you want. They seem to retain their memories. You can also take these planarians, you can cut them in half, and without changing their DNA whatsoever, you can induce these macro level, macro mutations, as they say, right? By depolarizing the wound, the scission point, and thus kind of tricking the organism's morphogenetic field to regenerate a second head rather than a tail. And then when that organism reproduces, you get more two-headed planarians. Now, you could argue at this point, okay, but the planarians reproduce by binary fission. They literally tear themselves in half. So maybe it's just carrying over onto the offspring. Michael Levin's very clever, though. So here's what he did. He started doing this thing where you can kind of Frankenstein these planarians together, where you can take like a piece of one and kind of incorporate it into a regenerating planarian, and it'll just kind of like scoop up that extra matter and make one organism. Because you got to think they're all clones, right? So it's actually not that difficult to achieve that with an organism like that. So what you can do, you can take your two-headed planarians. Again, no change in DNA needed whatsoever. And take a piece of one and incorporate it into a regular planarian with one head. And then when that planarian reproduces, there's a certain probability that its offspring will have two heads instead of one. So where's the two-headedness, right? Right. So again, it gets weird, harder and harder to explain this without invoking these more, let's say, ontologically substantial ideas about memory and nature and about morphogenetic fields. And I think that ultimately that's going to be inescapable. And honestly, Levin might not be on the same page with me on this, but it seems to me like he's intentionally angling for that, because when he was talking about this, he was talking about how a lot of researchers presumed that these regenerative capacities were mediated by stem cells. And so if that's what he thought was going on, then presumably he would have pursued the research in that direction. But what he did is he used radiation. He irradiated the planarians after they were cut in half to kill all of their stem cells, to show that when they regenerate the second head and whatnot, it's not the stem cells that are doing it.
Wow.
It's elsewhere. And so it's like, it seems like if you're doing that, like he kind of sees where this is going. But anyway, that's me reading into it. That's not him talking. So
Yeah, okay. That's actually genius the way he organized those experiences seems. That's wow.
yeah.
That's phenomenal. Okay, so what is bioelectricity then? I know he uses that term a lot. Is it just can we invoke that? Because I'll tell you what, I want to get into organ transplants and memories, but I've spoken to, are you familiar with Dr. Jack Cruz on the internet? Okay. So he's this neurosurgeon, and he is big into, he calls it quantum biology. And he's basically just really hammers hard into the physics of the organism, and looking at health through the lens of physics and even quantum physics. So he basically says that that water itself can retain a memory, and this is somehow affected by the electromagnetic fields that are emitted, within an organism. And he points to this scientist named Luc Montagnier. Are you familiar with his work or his experiment?
No.
Okay. So Luc Montagnier did this amazing experiment where he recapitulated DNA just by doing something like manipulating the electromagnetic fields of within a system and changing the structure of water. I'm really butchering this, to be honest. Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm not getting the experiment exactly right, but it's something analogous to that. So is that similar to the idea of bioelectricity, that the electromagnetic frequencies could affect maybe the structure of water and maybe hold some type of memory? Is that kind of,
Yeah, so
yeah.
there's a lot going on here, I think. And this is something that I've really been pursuing a lot lately. I am not a physicist, so this is not exactly my forte, but it's something I've been really trying to delve into, because it definitely seems like there are these very fascinating connections here between electricity and plasma and the nature of life. Most physicists will tell you that electricity is just a purely mechanistic phenomenon. It just behaves in these, predictable ways. We have our equations. We know how it works. But there's some really mysterious things about electricity. And I feel like as electricity becomes incorporated into these more complex systems, you get spookier and spookier things going on. And even at the more basic level, with something like water, you could have some really spooky things going on potentially. So, with regards to Levin's work in particular, though, so he talks a lot about bioelectricity. And within the context of his experimental research and theoretical ideas, he's conceptualizing this in terms of patterns of electrical gradients between cell membranes, which is to say that you've essentially got a kind of blueprint, sort of, within the electrical gradients between the cells, which is to say that an individual cell kind of knows whether it needs to reproduce or not reproduce, or differentiate in a certain way, or undergo apoptosis, or what have you, on the basis of the neighboring cells and the kind of like ion exchange relationships there. And so that is a kind of electricity, because those are all on the basis of positive and negative charge. It's electrical, right? So yeah, you've got that going on, but I really feel like that's probably ultimately going to be revealed to just be kind of something very surface level, actually, because even looking at it that way, even like when you look at the whole organism and you can see that kind of pattern there within those electrical gradients, you still got to ask the question, well, where did that pattern come from? And if it's not the DNA, then, you know, what is it, right? So yeah, there's some mysteries here. I think there's definitely some deep connections between these ideas of electromagnetism and plasma, and the idea of morphogenetic fields that hopefully we'll be able to tease out more in the future. But just to kind of tease that a little bit, if we go to Whitehead's ideas, for example, his idea of conceptual prehensions and these mental poles. So I said before that we can conceptualize those as fields of possibility. So look at an atom this way, for example. You've got the atomic nucleus, and it's got its thing going on, and then you've got this so-called electron orbital shell, in which the way it's described in physics books as well, there's an electron, but it has non-locality. So this electron, which is somehow a wave and a particle, but neither, is kind of in all those different positions at the same time. But then when you make some kind of interaction event happen, then it's at one particular place. And then I guess it goes back to being in this non-locality state, the coherent state, as they call it. It's all like, what, you know, I'm sure the equations work. I'm not going to contest that necessarily, but the explanations for what's going on here are very convoluted. And but through this more Whiteheadian perspective, what's going on actually seems very clear. The field, the electron orbital shells, are distributions of possible events. And then what we're calling the electron is not an enduring physical or quasi-physical object that endures over time. It's just an event, right? So when you detect the electron, what's really happening is you're taking a distribution of possible electronic events, and then boom, you've got an actual electronic event, which is drawn from that cloud of potentiality, right? So you don't need any particles to both be there and not be there magically at the same time. So anyway, the relationship here then to electricity is that if electrons or any kind of quantum entities are that, we don't have particles and fields. What we have are fields of possible events, and then we have the events, right? So if that is the case, then those fields are morphogenetic fields. They I would argue, are ontologically the exact same thing as the morphogenetic fields that are causing those planarians to do what they do within Michael Levin's experiments.
Yeah.
So what that then implies is that really the morphogenetic fields of more complex organisms are just kind of holons, which are created through the weaving together of these kind of micro level morphogenetic fields. And at the micro level, they are electromagnetic. So at the macro level, you would expect electromagnetism to be playing a very significant role as well. So yeah.
Okay, awesome. And let's touch a little bit now on the organ transplants, because Dr. Jack Kruse, I've spoken to him and he told me about the story um, about him doing an organ transplant for a patient in which they replaced their heart completely. They did a heart transplant surgery, and the person who had taken their heart and the person who died and they took their organ, right? They were in a car crash and they were eating McDonald's French fries. And the scene of the crash, he had French fries all over him. And yeah, this is the way he describes it. So they take his heart and put it into this new patient, and this new patient has no idea about what happened to this person. And she comes back months later after the heart transplant to Dr. Kruse and says, "Doc, I have a problem. Like, it's really an issue. Ever since I got my heart transplant, I have this severe craving for McDonald's French fries." Now, that's just like an anecdote. It's a story.
Mm-hmm.
But I personally really trust the word of Dr. Jack Kruse, and I trust that that story is true, and he's talked about it multiple times. I just thought it was so interesting, and I couldn't help but think, but that's morphic resonance right there when I first encountered it. And then I saw some of your videos where you talk about a little bit about organ transplants. Could you maybe talk a little bit about some of those stories if you remember them? Of the maybe some similar things happening where memories being retained in those organs?
Yeah, I mean, we have no reason to believe whatsoever that these patients are lying about their experiences. That, I mean, again, experience is if you're an empiricist, experience is what you're starting with, and experiences are always going to be subjective and then intersubjective, and then we slap that honorary objective on them once we feel like we really latched onto something that's real. But yeah, this should be treated as data because it's not just one person saying things like this. There are many accounts like this of organ transplants, particularly heart transplants, resulting in apparently transferred memories, weird idiosyncrasies in terms of like aversions or cravings, things like that, paranoias. There's a lot going on there, and I mean, it's not really possible to hand wave this away. There's quite a bit of medical literature about it now. Now, the materialist explanation for this, of course, is just one hand wave or another, depending
Yeah.
on which one you go with. I mean, you can say, well, there's neurons in the heart. Um, but there's not many, really. There's not enough, it would seem, to have complex memories. And then you got to ask
Hmm.
questions about like, well, if the memories are in the heart and not the brain, then why is that? Or is it like that it's somehow the brain's making its memories in the brain and like duplicating them in the
Hmm.
heart? And
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, it gets complicated very quickly. But if we look at this in terms of morphic resonance, then what's going on here is you don't need complex stored memories to be transferred from one patient to the other within the organ. All that needs to be transferred from point A to point B is the kind of seed, as it were, the ability to tune into that memory, as it were, because the memory itself is actually stored in the past, and the way that that past is then reiterated in the present is through what Sheldrake calls morphic resonance, which I think is identical to what Whitehead is calling hybrid prehension. It is the way
Hmm.
in which these mental poles, these morphogenetic fields, are able to influence one another in a way that's not localized in the same way that mechanical efficient causation is. The physicist David Bohm came to very similar conclusions. He actually was influenced by Sheldrake and Whitehead, and he developed this idea of an implicate order, which I think is very crucial here because it's essentially the idea that these morphogenetic fields they correspond to physically, spatiotemporally localized bodies in the explicate world, the physical world, as Bohm would say. But in themselves, they are implicate. And what he means by that is that they are all kind of in one another within this singularity where influence between them is not a matter of extension, like whether objects are close to each other or not. It's a matter of the formative similarity, so the morphogenetic proximity within morphogenetic space rather than physical extensive space. And so yeah, you take that idea and you run with it, and things get weird really quick, and but in really fascinating ways. Yeah, good.
No, no, sorry. I was just laughing because yeah, that's
Oh,
it's so cool. Yeah.
mhm. Well,
Is it cutting out? I don't know. It's
it
Can you hear
it
me?
glitched for just a second. I think we're good though.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's probably mine. Yeah, we're yeah, what you're saying. You're talking about morphic resonance being this relationship between in similarity, the way Sheldrake talks about it, which is so fat. It's so outside like modern scientific thought, but it's so fascinating. Yeah. You were saying?
Yeah, and so and again, if we look at Michael Levin's work, it's just like I don't know. I find it hard to believe that he doesn't see that as where it's going because he talks about what he calls morphogenetic spaces, which are exactly what I was just implying, this idea that you can think of morphogenetic processes as existing within this kind of landscape. If you really wanted it to be accurate, it couldn't just be like a two-dimensional or even three-dimensional landscape because there are just so many things going on here. But again, you can think of it as a space, a kind of
Mm.
hyperdimensional space, and things, processes can be closer together or further away within that space. Now, this would be the similarity-based influence that Sheldrake talks about, that when these processes are closer together and more similar morphogenetically, then there's going to be a greater influence between them. And that influence is going to essentially operate as a kind of Sheldrake calls it an automatic averaging. You can think of the metaphor of like a composite image of different images being imposed upon one another, right?
Mm.
And so
Mm.
what's happening here is any kind of developmental processes are going to take certain pathways through morphogenetic space. You start with an embryo, and there's a lot of different creatures that could come from that embryo. And so there has to be something there that's kind of guiding that developmental process. Or even your body right now, your body isn't changing very much, but it's got to know how to repeat itself. You know, it's constantly regenerating. And so the idea here is that this morphic resonance then is essentially kind of carving out the developmental pathway that these organic processes follow.
Mm.
And again, there's all kinds of implications here for memory and parapsychology and spiritual experiences and organ
Oh yeah.
transplants and
Yeah.
really just everything. Yeah.
Okay. How you talked about this a little bit in one of your videos. How does Stephen Jay Gould in his idea of punctuated equilibrium within evolution? By the way, that guy was seen as like a heretic as well, a heretic. Like he was like, yeah, an outcast because of this idea. How does it relate to morphic resonance or morphogenetic fields?
I think it could potentially. So Stephen Jay Gould was a very influential uh, paleontologist and evolutionary theorist during the 70s, 80s, and then I believe he died in the early 90s, sometime in
Mm.
the 90s, I believe. But anyway, him and Richard Dawkins were like arch nemesis
Yeah.
essentially, and Dawkins went to bat for this kind of doctrine of gradualism, the idea that these evolutionary processes have to increment via very tiny steps over time. And Gould was really just much more of an empiricist about it, because he was saying, look, if we actually look at the fossil record, you don't see that. You see jumps being made. And the Dawkinsonian argument was, well, that's just because the fossil record's incomplete. And the reason Dawkins was so insistent about this, and why many of Dawkins' followers were so insistent about this, was because within the neo-Darwinian paradigm, there are theoretical reasons why you should believe that gradualism should be the case, and it deals with a kind of morphogenetic landscape in a way. They call it a fitness landscape. And essentially, it's a kind of metaphor. You can think of it as a landscape, and it has hills, and the vertical axis then corresponds to evolutionary fitness. So the higher up an organism is on that landscape, the closer it is to the peak of one of those hills, the more genetically fit it is. So the argument goes something like this. If you have any big mutations, those are going to be far more likely to have a detrimental effect on the organism's fitness than not. Because again, the bigger the mutation, that's going to kind of, you can think of it as a circle kind of expanding outward from the organism. And so there's going to be more room in that space for valleys, essentially, where the mutation just kills the organism, essentially, or makes it so that it can't reproduce or is detrimental in some kind of way. Whereas if you have tiny mutations, then it's going to be much more likely that your organism just kind of inches itself a little bit more towards the top of the hill. And so theoretically, then it should be that only micromutations play a significant role in evolution. And really, this was a battle of abstraction versus empiricism. Dawkins was arguing from a purely abstract theoretical perspective. Gould was arguing from the actual fossil record. And if we look at this morphogenetics research now and what that might imply about this, I think it weighs very heavily in Gould's favor. So some of Levin's research, for example, has been about reorganizing embryonic cells. And he's done a number of different things with this. So first of all, there are the xenobots, where he took the embryonic dermal cells from tadpole embryos and then just kind of artificially brought them together so that they began to form these, he calls them xenobots, and they're essentially these little balls of cells that can move around and eat and grow and reproduce, and like most of the things that you would expect an organism to be able to do. But this is very problematic from a neo-Darwinian perspective, because those little artificial organisms don't exist in nature. They only exist due to human intervention. So what the hell is programming them to do those things, right? They've never existed before. The natural selection has had no time to act upon those organisms to make them behave the way they do. They just do it somehow. So somehow that's just in there, right? Another experiment related to this would be what he did with tadpoles, where he essentially surgically rearranged the eyes of the tadpole such that the eyes were the what do you call it? The optical nerve was connecting to the spine instead of going directly into the brain. So in most organisms, that's how it works. The eyes do not go through the spinal cord. The signals are sent directly into the brain. And so the idea was, well, if we rearrange it in this way, will the tadpoles be able to see? Will they be able to figure out how to use that information coming from those eyes? The eyes are working just fine, but will they be able to decipher that now that the information is going through their spinal cord instead of the regular trajectory? And what they found was, yes, those tadpoles can see, in fact, which implies that even with something like that, where there's no point in evolutionary history where the ancestors of those organisms had eyes that were sending signals through the spinal column. That just didn't happen ever, and yet they're able to figure it out. So what does that imply for this whole Gould versus Dawkins thing? What it seems to imply then is that macromutations actually might be far more viable than Dawkins gave them credit for, because no matter where a macromutation might land an organism within its fitness landscape, that organism, because it is a purposefully self-organizing system, can just climb up the damn hill, right? And so a macro mutation, let's say you've got two fitness hills, right? And you've got one over here in your population of organisms, and then you've got another hill. The Darwinians, the neo-Darwinians rather, I should say, the Dawkinsonians would argue the only
Yeah.
way to get from point A to point B is for the fitness landscape itself to move, or for an extremely unlikely macro mutation to send an organism from the apex of one hill to the apex of the next one. What Levin's research seems to suggest that even if you got a mutation that lands the organism somewhere over here in no man's land, as long as it's able to continue doing its thing, then it can potentially reorganize its own physiology in relation to its environment in order to continue surviving and reproducing, which means it can actually get to that other hill, even if the mutation itself is initially something that would seem to be very
Wow.
detrimental.
Yeah, and it makes evolution purposive. It's not this blind process. It's not the blind watchmaker like Dawkins
It's
famously
not
talked
blind,
about.
and it's not blind, and there are no watches. Yeah, that's what I say.
Yeah. So you use this phrase, absolutely amazing phrase. I think in one of your videos, I don't know where you got it. Maybe it was from you or someone else. You said the dreaming gardener as opposed to the blind watchmaker. Was that
Yeah,
you or
yeah, that was me. I don't know. Maybe somebody else has said that. I don't think so. I'm pretty sure that's
that's
me.
that's a great line.
Thank you.
I'm gonna use that. Yeah. Okay, just we have time, I think, for just one more kind of section. This will be the end. I know let's talk a little bit about the scientific dogma and some pushback against these ideas. And it's pretty much encapsulated in this video that you created. You had this video, it's 2 hours long. It's titled How Science Became Unscientific, in which you detail a lot of these unscientific practices that the scientists themselves or the scientific worldview entails. And then you got this response from Professor Davey, who is a YouTuber I'm very familiar with. You know, he's a great guy. He has some great explanation videos on his channel. But he took this position of immediately trying to mock you, and it's like the most ad hominem thing you could imagine, right? It's not all. Maybe some of his points were valid, right? But when you just go full on ad hominem with people, I've had this critique of him before in the past, even with people that were supporting him and on his side. He just kind of loses his cool. Anyways, that's my opinion on him. But what's your opinion on that whole? I don't want to call it beef, but skirmish, let's call it, or that kind of back and forth you guys had.
Well, I think this is a great example of what we kind of opened with this conversation, which is the way that scientific ideology can potentially come to form, come to play a very ideological and really a kind of spiritualistic role, but in a way that it kind of obfuscates itself and people don't realize that's what they're doing. So with people like Dave, and this is, I don't know Dave, I don't know what his history is, but I can make some educated guesses because I know quite a bit about what people like that tend to be like, people who are very hardliners for the kind of scientific materialism worldview, people like Dan Barker, Michael Shermer, Susan Blackmore, blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
Generally speaking, you see a similar pattern with these people. They start off as very kind of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed idealists. They either have a religious upbringing or something along those lines. Then as they mature, usually in their teens to early 20s, they have a crisis of faith, which just shatters their worldview. They feel so betrayed by it. It's very traumatic for them because they just can't believe in the thing anymore. And in trying to get away from dogmatism, they end up discovering science. And they're like, oh, wow, now I can be right about the thing, you know? And so the way I describe it is kind of like this. You know, Carl Jung has this very, very appropriate statement. He says that if you do not make the contents of the unconscious conscious, then they will rule your life and you will call them fate. And this is a perfect example of this, because what's happening here is you have people like that who have a very, very strong religious impulse. They really want to believe in something. They really want to be certain and right. They want to have a team that they can fight for. But because of that kind of disillusionment they went through, what happens is they kind of force that impulse down. But instead of getting away from it, what happens is it just kind of manifests in a way that it disguises itself as something else. So the way I've said it before is like you try to get away from the unconscious, but you can't get away from it. It just goes behind the curtain, puts on a fake mustache and a pair of glasses, comes around the other side and shakes your hand, and you're none the wiser. And that's how it goes with these people, because they end up really being extremely religious fundamentalists about these ideas of like established science and whatnot. And that, some people would frame that as though it's bad because it's a religious impulse. And I don't really think of it that way. I think the problem here isn't that there's an element of religiosity or spirituality here. The pathological, potentially pathological aspect of this is that it's obfuscated. The fact that people who are doing that don't realize they're doing it, because to them it's just like, no, I'm just I'm just spewing the facts. That's all I care about. This is just purely objective truth that I care about. There's no ideological or spiritualistic stuff here to see. It's just the facts. Dawkins says something like this. He's actually said before a rather ridiculous statement that we shouldn't talk about belief in evolution, because you don't have to believe in a fact. You just accept a fact. So look at that reframing. Then it's not believing in something. It's you're either accepting it or you're a denialist, right? You're a heretic, right? And yeah, so you see these exact same features that we associate with religious fundamentalism popping up in almost the exact same way using a slightly different language. And it's very common these days. I mean, we're in a world where we're like 23, 24 years removed from the September 11th attacks. That was a really big watershed moment for the Western world, certainly, maybe just the global civilization itself, because it really laid the groundwork for a period of time in which people were very, very disillusioned with spirituality and religiosity as such, because there was kind of two major responses, certainly in the United States, at least, with regards to that. One was, okay, it's because Islam is bad and Christianity is good. And usually those people were pushing a very kind of Christian nationalist type agenda. And so the people who pushed back against that, they didn't really have a nuanced way of responding to that. So their response was, no, it's not that Islam is bad and Christianity is good. It's that all religion is bad and science is good. Okay. And so that really worked its way into the collective culture for quite a while. And even today, you see a lot of young people who are drawn to that. But what's interesting, though, is that for a lot of the young people today, it's not something that they're drawn to because they're running away from a more adolescent sense of religiosity. For them, it like is that adolescent sense of religiosity, because it's what they're given as part of their upbringing, essentially. And so it's going to be really interesting to see that dynamic play out when those kids get a little older and then they start becoming disillusioned in the same way that my generation got disillusioned about religion back in like 2010 or whatever, so because it's just going to play itself out in a slightly different way, and it's fun to watch, also kind of horrifying in some ways. But
it's a roller coaster for sure. There's this awesome quote that reminds me of everything you just said by Whitehead himself. He said, "Every scientific man, in order to preserve his reputation, has to say he dislikes metaphysics. What he means is he dislikes having his metaphysics criticized." So that's a mic drop right there. I mean,
absolutely.
That's an amazing one. I just want to squeeze one more question in, and this will be the end. Do you think that nihilism is a byproduct of this materialist belief? What I mean by that is, I in one point in my life was like I would say maybe towards an atheist materialist, kind of had this belief, and I just kind of had this subjective feeling of being very empty and sad and nihilistic. And I've changed a lot since then, but with these ideas, this idea that the universe is alive and is conscious and there's more to discover, it really brings me a sense of joy that I don't think I really got back in those days when I had that old belief system. So I'm wondering, do you have you experienced maybe a similar thing? And yeah.
Yeah, so the thing about a more scientific rationalist position is at least it maintains some kind of meaning, or at least it tries to, because it weaves this kind of meta narrative of enlightenment techno-scientific progress. So the idea is something like this: we were all naked, starving barbarians, dirty, beating each other with sticks in the Paleolithic, and then gradually we developed technologies and we got smarter, and then we slowly shed the vestiges of superstition and religiosity until we got to the point that we're at now. And that will just continue into the future. Technology will solve all our problems, and then we'll have some kind of Star Trek quasi-socialist utopia. And that works for some people. I mean, some people go their entire lives believing that, but there are some pretty big cracks in it for a number of reasons. The main one being, if once you back up from it a little bit and you're going, okay, well, what's the point, right? And there's not really a good answer to that. It's really a worldview that can only hold together insofar as it has an opponent to defeat. And typically the opponent they feel themselves trying to defeat is, the religious fundamentalists or the New Agers or, whoever. But once you forget about those people for a while and you're just left with that belief system, you're just like, this kind of sucks, actually. Like, because there's very little there. It's very insubstantial. Everything, if you really start to follow it to its logical conclusions, just looks like these completely nihilistic power relations. You keep following that thread a little bit, and then you're suddenly realizing that that worldview hardly even has any room for the idea of scientific truth, because it hardly has any room for an idea of objective truth at all. And yeah, this can spiral into a very devastating nihilism if it's followed through to its logical conclusion, I think, which is why I think we're seeing such a massive resurgence of interest in more spiritualistic ideas, more far out ideas right now, because again, it's been 24 years ish since the seeds of that materialistic atheist worldview were laid within popular culture, at least. Prior to that, it was more of an academic intellectual thing. Most people were just kind of casually religious, let's say. But it was during that little 20-year period that ordinary people, really got to try out that worldview in their ordinary lives apart from academia. And what we're seeing right now, I think, is that this kind of en masse realization, gradual, albeit, that it just doesn't work. You need a worldview that actually gives you a way to orient yourself towards reality and to deal with other people and to deal with yourself and to make sacrifices and to figure out when it's appropriate to make sacrifices and when you need to plant your flag in the mud and let them come at you. If you don't have a substantial framework for contextualizing those things, then you're just kind of lost and you're never sure whether you even have good reasons for what you're doing. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Keelan, for coming on. This was amazing. Like I learned so much. I'd love to have you on again. I have like a whole two more pages of questions. But I just
Oh,
wanted
let's
to
do
make
it. Yeah.
sure. Yeah, awesome. So Yeah, thank you for coming on. Any last remarks you want to leave with the audience with?
Nothing too substantial or theoretical. Just glad to
Okay.
be here. If y'all want to check out my YouTube channel, again, that's formscapes.com. Check out our website formscapes.org. We're starting a series of webinar courses in May 4th precisely. On the weekends, we're going to be doing some courses going over a few books. Y'all can go over there and check out exactly what we got going on. And yeah, that'll about do it. Thank you so much for having me on. You had great questions. It's a super fun conversation. We should totally do it again sometime. Have a good one, man.
See
Nice
ya.
to meet
Take
you.
care.
Yeah.